In this quick lecture, we want to consider the goal and two means or tasks of theology, particularly according to Thomas Aquinas, or at least using Thomas Aquinas. Really, all theologians would agree on these issues, but Thomas will be our guide. What then is the final cause or goal of theology? Well, we can respond to this question in many ways. But one is saying that among the final cause is saying everything with us and among creatures of God. Saying everything with us and among creatures of God. Indeed, this goal involves our two fundamental tasks or means. For one, everything of potency and imperfection in creatures is to be said of God through negative judgment, saying that God is not such. But for another, everything of act and perfection in creatures is to be said of God through affirmative judgment, saying that God is such. We sometimes speak of this as removing the imperfection and retaining the perfection. These are the two fundamental tasks in theology. Saying that something is or is not of God. And as we see in other lectures, these two tasks together correspond to the first magisterial goal of two, which Thomas gives in Quadlibital 4, question 9a3 respondeo, or to what Lonergan called the functional specialty of dogmatics. Remove the imperfection and retain the perfection. Thomas cast this in terms of dissimilitudes and similitudes, differences and similarities, or contrasts and comparisons, we would say today. And indeed, he founds this on the real, primarily efficient causality of God upon creatures. As he says in SCG 1c29, quote, God bestows all perfections to creatures, and through this that he does, God simultaneously has similitude and dissimilitude with all. God bestows all perfections, and as a result, he simultaneously has similitude and dissimilitude with all. Similitude is to be retained inasmuch as it is such, and dissimilitude is to be removed inasmuch as it is such. Thomas, in this text, is somewhat alluding to Dionysius, whom he quotes shortly after. Quote, the same creaturely realities, Dionysius says, are similar and dissimilar to God. Similar in the aspects of their perfection or act, but dissimilar in the aspects of their imperfection or potency. Indeed, both Thomas and Dionysius found this on the real participation of creatures in something of God, whereupon there is proximity and distance, we might say. And one of my favorite quotations where Thomas is quoting and slightly expanding a line from Dionysius's Divine Names, chapter 1, this resulting similitude and dissimilitude he compares to this physical proximity and distance. Listen to this quotation. All are encircled about the first cause as if having derived from it according to a certain similitude, but also from it all are separated. And it, that is the first cause, as a result of this, is all in all, inasmuch as every perfection of every being is God his very self causally. According to the elocution in 1 Corinthians 15, God is all in all, close quote. God is all in all, i.e., all perfections in all beings. God is all in all. Every perfection in creatures is to be affirmed of him, finding the similitudes of divinity or measuring the nearness of creatures to their first cause. And yet, as Lateran 4 reminds us, in whatsoever that similitude is found, dissimilitude there also is to be found. Every imperfection in creatures is to be negated of him, finding the dissimilitudes of divinity or marking the distances of creatures from their first cause. Thomas gestures to this goal and these two tasks or means from his very early days. For example, in I sent D2Q1A2, he founds this idea on two sed contra authorities, Augustine and Aristotle, perhaps his highest authorities beyond the apostles and Christ himself. Augustine says, although Thomas then quotes from Anselm, in fact, that everything which is perfect is to be attributed to God, for example, wisdom, goodness, and others of this sort. And then also the philosopher says, and also his commentator Averroes agrees, that in God is found all nobilities discovered in all creaturely genera. Quote, therefore in God is discovered power, goodness, and whatever else is of nobility in whatsoever created reality, close quote. Thomas himself follows in the wake of these authorities and begins his own respondeo with these two steps, which he will take throughout the whole journey of his theological career. He says, quote, I respond that it is to be said that whatever is of being and goodness in creatures, the whole of it is from the Creator, whereas imperfections therein is not from him, but happens on the part of creatures, inasmuch as they are from nothing, close quote. Retain perfection as from and so similar to God, remove imperfection as not from and so dissimilar to God. We find Thomas say the same thing later also in his master texts. For example, in De Potentia Q1A1 Respondeo, Thomas notes in a very important quotation as follows, our intellect strains to express God just as something most perfect. Nevertheless, because our intellect cannot arrive from its natural place into God except via similitude of effects of God as cause, and because in creatures something supremely perfect which utterly lacks imperfection is not found, therefore our intellect from diverse perfections found in creatures strains to designate him, although something is lacking in each and every one of those creaturely perfections. Nevertheless, our intellect so designates God from these perfections that whatsoever of some imperfection of those perfections is conjoined, the whole of it, our intellect removes from God, close quote. When we find some perfection in creatures, we say that God is or has this, but when we find some imperfection, we say that God is not or does not have that. At this point, we can helpfully say that, broadly speaking, there are two situations wherein we engage these two tasks of retain the perfection, remove the imperfection. Two situations we're going to engage these two tasks. On the one hand, sometimes the situation is, so to speak, some perfection over here and some imperfection over there. Thomas speaks of this situation later in De Potentia Q7A5 ad 8. He says, in creatures are to be considered certain aspects according to which they are assimilated or have similitudes to God. For example, when we find their being, living, and understanding, and others of this sort. He then continues, whereas there are also certain aspects according to which creatures differ from God, i.e., have dissimilitudes to God, differences which are consequent to the creature as it is ex nihilo, i.e., as it has participated the perfections and so determined or contracted them. For example, when we find creatures' potentiality, privation, motion, and others of this sort, Thomas says. The former, namely creatures' being, living, understanding, and so on, can be affirmed of God truly, whereas the latter, namely creatures' potentiality, privation, motion, etc., cannot be affirmed of God truly and so are to be negated or removed from him. On the other hand, though, sometimes the situation is different. Sometimes the situation is that in the perfection itself, some perfection is found. It's not some perfection over here and some imperfection over there, but something which in some aspect involves act in perfection, but which in another aspect involves potency and imperfection. In the perfection itself, some imperfection is found. Thomas speaks of this situation back in De Potentia Q1A1 Respondeo, which we just quoted above. He continues there and says, quote, for example, this name esse or being signifies something complete and simple, i.e., perfection, but also not subsistent, i.e., imperfection. Whereas, on the other hand, this name substance signifies something subsistent, perfection, but it also signifies subject to another, i.e., imperfection. This is exactly what Lateran 4 intends when it says, in whatsoever similitude find the dissimilitude. Therefore, Thomas concludes, we posit in God, or affirm of God, these names substance and being, saying that God is a substance, or merely that he is, but we are affirming substance in the aspect of its subsistence, i.e., its perfection, not in the aspect of its substanding under some accident, i.e., its imperfection, which we negate of God. Similarly, we are affirming being, or saying that God is, quote, in the aspect of simplicity and completeness, its perfection, but not in the aspect of its inherence, how esse inheres in another, or its accidentality, i.e., its imperfection. Similarly, in all names of God, Thomas actually continues and compares these two tasks that he's just given the examples of esse and substance for. He compares these two tasks further to the names operation, such as understanding or willing, and also power or potentia, which always go together in Duenas. We say that God operates, Thomas says, in the aspect of its ultimate completeness, involving perfection, but not in the aspect of that into which the operation passes, involving imperfection. Similarly, we say that God has power, but we are only affirming this in its aspect that it remains and that it is principle of operation, whereas we're negating power in its aspect that power is completed through operation and therefore involves imperfection. So retain perfection, remove imperfection, in every similitude find the dissimilitude. Although in theology there are other tasks or variation on these two tasks, these are the two fundamental tasks or means of theology. We say something is in God, or we say something is not in God. And all throughout, our goal is that everything with us and among creatures eventually falls under that something, which we will have reason to either affirm or negate of God insofar as it is similar or dissimilar to him. These are the end or final cause and the means of theology. Hope this short lecture was helpful. Thanks so much.